Thank you for joining us this morning. We're going to be covering how to add your Flow Hive Super to your Flow Hive. Now there's a few tips and tricks along the way, so tune in. If you've got any questions, put it in the comments below and we'll get to answering those while we're live. So this is your Flow Hive Super, and this contains the frames that my father and I invented. This is the box that allows you to harvest honey directly out of your hive without opening it. So just the terminology, because if you're new to beekeeping, you're like, what's a super? A super is a box for collecting honey. Now if you look at this hive here, the bottom box is the brood box. So this is where the queen's laying her eggs, they're raising their young, they're drawing their natural comb the way they've always done it, and then when they're filled up that and it's nice and full and there's lots of bees, they move up here into your super, and that's where they store the honey for you to harvest. Luckily they store more than they need for themselves, not all the time but a lot of the time, and we get to share in the beautiful thing we call honey. So once you've assembled your box, and if you've got a cedar hive like this, you might like to add a coat of oil, or you might like to paint it, it's up to you. And then the next thing we're going to do is insert your frames into the Flow Super. So I've already done that, and there's a few things to do to prepare it before you put it onto the hive. So I'm going to get a key, here's one here. Now the first thing and most important thing is you want the cells to be aligned when you put it onto your hive. If they're not aligned, let's say it's been shipping and it's been banging around like this, you'll find some of the cells won't actually be lined up, and then the bees can't use them for honey storage. So before you put it on your hive, it's important to go through and reset all of those frames. To do that, you see there's two slots here at the top. You'll need to insert a key into the top slot and turn it, and that simply pushes the parts down and makes all the cells line up into hexagons. Well, partly formed hexagons. The bees then go cover it all in wax, complete the cells, and start adding their nectar and going through that process of reducing that water content to create honey. Okay, so in order to do that, you need to pull out these caps here. So all the way along the top. Then it's a process of making sure you're inserting it into the top slot here. Just put it in all the way to the back till you feel that clunk, and turn it 90, and now it's ready to go. So we just go through each frame like that, and that gets all of those cells in the right position for the bees to start using. Important step. Okay, almost done. And don't forget to put the caps back in. If you leave these caps out, what happens is ants can go and live in that area at the top, which can be a bit of a nuisance. They don't really affect anything unless they really drag a whole lot of dirt into there, but still leave your caps in like that. So they're now all prepared to go on the hive. The next thing you want to do, and let's have a look at this. See how this is forming a nice flat window. You want it, if you move your finger across there, not to be massive steps between them. And the reason why that is bees could escape if there's gaps. So to get them all in line like that, all of the frames just need pushing forwards. So if we go around to the other side here, what we've done is put an adjustment screw on the back here, and that just needs winding out a little bit to take up the slack. Now each box can vary a little bit depending on whether you're using your own box or one of ours. So what we've done is we've put an adjustment screw to to just take up that difference. So all you need to do is lift the frame like this, screw it out a little bit, and just make sure it still goes in, but it's pushing the frame forward. So you go through and just wind them out a little bit, still make sure they can drop in, and then you end up with a nice flat window here. That's another important step. What we're going to do is put the window cover back on like that, and then also the key access cover. This is the key access cover. It goes on like that, and you're ready to put that on your hive. The things you'll need is your smoker, your queen excluder, your frames all set to go in your Flow Super, and then you're ready to go. If you've got questions, put them in the comments below. We're going to do that for you now so you can see what it's all about. I'm going to add a few puffs of smoke into the entrance here. There we go. And that should be sufficient. I'll leave the smoker by the entrance so the bees keep getting a whiff of smoke. That'll just help them calm down, so the process of taking the roof off will be a bit easier. If you're new to beekeeping, do make sure you're well protected. You need a good bee suit or bee jacket, have your gloves, wear your gloves, and only once you're more experienced should you experiment with not having gloves on.
Cedar, does adjusting the tilt of your hive matter before putting on your super?
Okay, that's a good question. So adjusting your tilt. Now, the Flow Hive 2, we've got levels in the back of the hive and the side of the hive. What you want to do is adjust it so that the bubble's in the middle, and that will give you the right tilt, and that's what your hive should stay on. That gives you a 3-degree slope backwards. If you've got a classic version, then the hive tilt is built into the base, and what you'll need to do is make sure what it's resting on is level. The Flow Hive 2 can go on any old surface, and the legs are adjustable on each corner to give it the right tilt. Bubble in the middle on the back, bubble in the middle on the side, and you're good to go. So the next thing I'm going to need, I'm just looking around for my hive tool. Could you just grab me a hive tool? And what we're going to do is lift the lid off this hive and go through the process of putting your super on top. So we can do that now. And you can see, oh wow, there was a little lizard that just ran across the top of this hive. Now we've got quite a few hive beetles in this hive, you can see here. And last week we saw that, and we hopefully starting to catch them down the bottom of the hive. Alright, so the queen could be on the roof because we've left the plug out, so we're looking around making sure the queen isn't inside the roof area. I generally like to leave the cap in because they do start building a whole lot of random comb in the roof, which can be fun for a while, but it can also be a bit of a nuisance and a mess to clean up. So this hive I probably will put a cap in. Okay, so one nice thing to do with a smoker is just to give your hands a little smoke. If you're going gloveless, that just masks a bit of your own smell. You can also add a little bit of a wisp of smoke just on top, which gets some of the bees running back in. Next, chisel end of your hive tool goes under the inner cover like this, and you can then lift that inner cover off. Just gently coming up. And the queen could be on the underside, so always make sure you rest the inner cover against the entrance so that if she is on here, she can just walk back into the hive. I'm not seeing her on there, but it's always a good idea just to have a quick look, and it's good training for looking for the queen. Okay, leaning that against the entrance. And we had an inspection of this hive last week, so there's no need for us to inspect that. We can see they're ready for a super. There's lots of bees in the hive. They've drawn out all the combs. They're ready to go. So that if you add the super too early, before all the frames are drawn out, or when there's no nectar flow, it'll be a slow process. It'll be a slow process of the bees starting to work the flow frames. So wait till you see lots of bees and all the frames are drawn out, and hopefully you've got a nectar flow ahead. Here we've had the rains recently. The paperbarks are all bursting into flower down in the heathland. So for us, it's a good time to add a super, but for a lot of people in the southern hemisphere, it's not a good time. So if you're in the northern hemisphere, then it's springtime, a good time to be adding your super. If you're in the southern hemisphere, you'd only add it if you're in the exceptional case like we are, where we're close to the coast in a subtropical region and we have good flowers in the winter time. Other people in Australia will be generally preparing their hive for winter and not adding more supers at this point. Any questions, put it in the comments below. We'll get to answering them. So I'm just adding a little bit of smoke because on top of here is going to go the queen excluder. And I know somebody will ask the question that I put my super on and the bees are taking a while to start working the flow frame. So I'll show you a little trick just now that will increase the speed at which they start working those flow frames. And that's simply adding a bit of wax from your brood box to the frame. So if we get the flow frame like this, and we get the bees out of the way and we start scraping some of the wax. Now, we were in here last week and cleaned up some of the wax, so there's not a whole lot of it, but for the purposes of the exercise, I'll show you just how to do that.
Craig Peterson's asking, how do you keep your flow frames so clean? His are covered in propolis.
Okay, the flow frames are brand new in this case. In terms of the brood frames here, which is probably what you're asking about, you can see the scrape marks from once before. So we've been in here just a week ago and we scraped some of the propolis and wax off the top. There's different schools of thought around that. Lots of beekeepers like to keep it nice and clean up here so it doesn't stick to the queen excluder. Others like to leave a bit of reserve there for the bees. So it just depends on your strategy there.
We've got a few Australians wondering when to add and when to take off their supers throughout the winter.
Okay, so Australia doesn't get a really long cold winter like many other continents. So in many parts of Australia we can leave the super on during the winter unless the colony is very small. Having said that, if you're in the southern parts of Australia, you still need to remove the queen excluder. So the bees, if they do ball up and move up the hive, the queen isn't left behind and she could perish below the excluder where there's no bees keeping her warm. So there's different strategies there. Some people like to take the flow supers off for the winter and some like to leave them on. The colder you are, if you're digging your hives out of snow, you're probably going to reduce your hive to have less supers for the winter, so the bees have a smaller area to maintain and keep warm during that time. Again, there's different schools of thought on that as well. So back to what we were doing, the flow frame is here. If you want to speed up the process or you're just getting impatient or you're curious, you scrape some wax off here. Ideally you'd have a bit more to scrape off, and you can just run the tool along your flow frame like this. Don't worry, you won't damage your flow frames, and you can do it right in the window where you can watch if you want to, like this. and the bees will go, hang on, that's out of place, and they'll recycle that wax and start using it in the immediate area, and away they go on that flow frame. The recipe to get them using your flow frames for the first time quickly is lots of bees in the box combined with a good nectar flow. Then it happens very quickly. So I'm going to put that back into the Flow Super, and there we go, ready to go. The next thing we need to do is add the queen excluder on top. So choose an opportune moment, use some smoke if you need to, just to drop that on without squashing any bees around the edge. So there we go, that's in place. Next thing is to add the Flow Super on top. So what the queen excluder does is it limits the queen from moving up into the super. Because the queen is bigger, she can't fit through this grid, which is a 4.3mm aperture. Okay, next the Flow Super goes on again, making sure there's no bees we're squashing. Now you just slide that into place, try and make sure it's neatly lined up like that, and you are ready to go. Next you've got your inner cover. Now the inner cover could still have a queen on it. I've had it resting on the entrance, so it's unlikely if she was there she would have run in. Now because we've got the excluder in place, we don't want to risk the queen actually ending up in the super. So what we're going to do is shake all the bees at the entrance, so that if by chance she was on the inner cover, she could just walk back into the hive. So I'm going to do that now. If you're trying to get bees off something, you need to give it a good sharp shake. The rest of the movements in beekeeping are generally slow and steady. So if you want to get those off, good sharp shake at the entrance here, just like this. You're holding it, and okay, so we've got a lot of the bees off. Still got a few beetles on this hive, and checking the last remaining bees, you can even go like that. There's only a couple of bees left and they're not the queen, so I'm satisfied that the queen isn't on the inner cover, and I can then put it on top of the Flow Super, and you're ready to go. Now there's a little bit of wax build up there. I might even just take that off so that it just seats nicely.
We've got a few people wanting to know about sizing.
Okay, there we go. So that goes like so, and the plug goes in the top, which we don't have here right now. And on top of that goes the roof of your hive. So just got to let that slide over the inner cover like that, and your hive's back together. The super's on. As your bees progress, you'll see them starting to work those cells. You can see there's none in the window yet. They're still down the bottom. As the colony grows, they'll expand into the super. You will have to exercise some patience. Some colonies are very slow to expand. If you've got a really strong season with a lot of flowers, a lot of nectar, then they'll start expanding quickly. Now last week we had a look in the brood box and we noticed there was lots of brood, even all the way out to the edges, so we're expecting this hive to pick up in numbers quite quickly. If that coincides with the nectar flow, we'll see them starting to work these flow frame cells. If you have a look in the back window, they're not quite coming up as yet. It'll take them a little while to get used to the idea of going through the queen excluder upstairs and starting to work those flow frames. So just again checking, we've got a nice flat window here. There's no gaps for bees to get out, and everything's ready for the bees. Okay, question on sizing.
So Ken Hayes is asking, does that fit on a standard super?
So the answer is yes. So some people prefer just to buy a super and add it to their conventional hive, and others prefer to buy the whole flow hive. Now, the advantages of getting the whole flow hive is we've thought about the tilt of the hive, and you've got it ready for the honey harvesting angle and so on. If you're using a conventional bottom board and conventional brood box, then what you might find is if you slope it back, then a whole lot of water will run into the hive because the landing board doesn't have the tilt like we've arranged it here, and water could sit in the hive. If you've got a bottom board which is just a straight conventional one without the mesh, then you actually need to slope the hive forward but then tilt it back for the honey harvesting. Now there's a bit of a caveat there, and that's at the back of the hive here we've designed a leak back point, so any honey that seeps through, depending on how well the bees seal the parts, goes into the trough and through a leak back point at the bottom here. Sometimes they block it up and you've got to unblock that, but we've designed it so the tube you put in for harvesting automatically unblocks that leak back point. So what happens if you're tilting the hive forward for a conventional bottom board and hive, then honey could build up in there, but the leak back point isn't in use, so you end up with a whole lot of honey that you can't even see up the other end in the trough, which could start to ferment. You then go to tilt your hive back to harvest, and all of a sudden you see there's a build up of honey in here you have to clean out before harvesting, that's all. So it is an advantage to have a bottom board that's a screen bottom board, and the landing board is sloped in such a way that you can have the hive on that 3 degree slope backwards, the honey harvesting angle, at all year round. So, but having said that, there's still a lot of people enjoying our Flow Supers on conventional hives, and it's certainly something you can do. And to answer your question, this is an 8-frame Langstroth sized box, and it has 6 flow frames in it because we've designed the flow frames with deeper cells, because bees, when they're away from the brood nest, like to create deeper cells for honey storage. So it all gets a bit confusing, but the Flow 6 is actually a 8-frame Langstroth, so it'll fit your standard 8-frame Langstroths. The Flow 7, which you can see over there behind the red flowers, is a 10-frame Langstroth size box. So if you're trying to match it up with your gear, the 7 is the 10-frame Langstroth, and the 6 is the 8-frame Langstroth. So that information's on our website, so you can help match it. And by all means, you can add conventional size. You can add other boxes, more brood boxes, more boxes for collecting honeycomb, whatever you want to do, you can add to your Flow Hive.
Belinda says, my bees are building comb between my Flow Super frames. This makes it difficult to lift flow frames to check that they are properly capped. I'm too scared to break these joins as it puts honey into the brood box.
Okay, so that's an unusual scenario to have a whole lot of comb between the flow frames. We've sized it so it's really unlikely that they do that, and I rarely, if ever, see it. So I'd like to see some photos of that comb in between the flow frames. But what you want to do, if that's the case, is actually get in there and cut that comb away and give them another chance to start building in the flow cells. We've put a lot of effort into trying to make sure they wouldn't do that, with the spacing between the comb surfaces being a bit too narrow for them to want to build comb between the flow frames. So again, it's unusual, but bees will be bees and do unusual things. You can count on that. And you'll find that eventually they'll get the idea. Once they've got them all waxed up and sticky, then they'll treat them like any other sticky box, and they're unlikely to build comb between the frames again. If you're just meaning at the top, sometimes you get into the situation where bees will be joining the flow frames together just at the top level, in which case you just cut that with your hive tool and that'll make it easier for you to lift the flow frames out.
Laurie's asking, can you use an escape board to remove the flow hive when packing down for winter?
The answer is yes. Let's take this off. The answer is yes, you can use an escape board. So for those that don't know what an escape board is, it's basically like a one-way bee valve for bees. It's a board that sits about this high in between two boxes, and in the corners is a system where the bees are likely to go one way but not come back the other. And beekeepers use it to clear out bees from a box so that when they come back there's less bees in the box, typically for when you're harvesting conventional in the conventional way. Now, what I find is if you try using an escape board, you'll often find that the bees a lot of bees stay in your super unless you have a good reason for them to go downwards. So generally what beekeepers do when they're using an escape board effectively is put a box underneath it that's got a whole lot of sticky comb that needs cleaning up, and all those bees go down to do that work and leave the top box empty. So I've found that if you just put an escape board between these two boxes, and this is already full of honey, then you'll find that there'll still be a whole lot of bees when you come back. So I've found them limited use. However, they are a popular tool for beekeeping, but more so when you are under supering with another super, so the bees go down and leave the top super ready to take back for the processing in the conventional way.
Dwayne's asking, how does the flow hive perform in the tropics?
Okay, it performs wonderfly in the tropics. We have people keeping bees in the tropical regions. We have people keeping bees when they're deep in snow in winter, and the flow hive works in all cases. We even have people keeping bees in flow hives that are different species. We've got people in Japan keeping bees in modified, shorter, smaller flow hive boxes with the Asian honeybee or the Apis cerana japonica, and so yeah, you can keep bees in tropical climates. You can keep them in really cold climates. What you find in the tropics is you get a very long season with honey coming and going all year round. We're in the subtropics here, but we're on the coast, and we find we get that here as well. So we get beautiful honey flows in the winter if we've had the rain, and we get good honey flows in spring. Summer can be a bit patchy, and that's about our season. Now, if you're in the colder regions, then the season tends to be compressed. The plants all wait to flower when in the warmer months, and you get an abundance of honey and nectar in those warmer times, and then not much at all in the colder times. So everywhere's got its unique patterns, and the best information will come from your local beekeepers. They tend to be really tuned in with the weather and what's going on with the flowers. They're watching the buds on the trees and starting to prepare to capture that honey flow when it comes.
Yorts is asking, what is your recommendation for starting a hive in autumn winter in Sydney?
Okay, autumn winter Sydney. So Sydney's on the coast. It's a little bit cooler than here, but that you could potentially start a hive if you thought there was flowers coming ahead. The best information will come from your local beekeepers on that. It could be a good idea to get yourself prepared and start your hive in spring, especially because if you're buying bees from a bee breeder, they're much more available in that springtime. But it's a good idea to get yourself prepared and get your order in and start watching videos and learning. We do have a new initiative, the beekeeper.org, with lots of high-level training videos aimed to bring people with no experience through to a deep knowledge of beekeeping. If you want to sink your teeth into that, it's free to try. So there's that option too. We've also got lots of training videos on our website. Back to your question, I would start a hive almost any time of year around here. Getting further down south like Sydney, you may choose to wait a little bit longer and do it in the springtime. It's up to you, but ask your local beekeepers. You might be in an area that has a good autumn and winter flow. Any questions, put them in the comments below and we'll get to answering them.
Cedar, what is a honey flow?
So a honey flow is a term used in beekeeping to describe the time in which flowers are producing nectar in abundant levels. The bees then go out and get that nectar and bring it back. So when a honey flow's on, you've got honey coming into your hive and you can see it really filling up the frames. It's a wonderful thing. You can watch in the back of the hive here as the bees start bringing in that nectar and splashing it all around the cell walls and start the evaporating process. And it's quite exciting. You'll often smell a beautiful smell in your apiary as they're evaporating the nectar. You can often connect that smell to what flowers they're going after. Some times of year we get the smell so strong it's almost overpowering, drifting through the office here from our apiary. So a honey flow is a wonderful and exciting time. Where we don't have much of a honey flow at the moment. We've got a bit of a trickle coming in. If we have a look at a hive over here, we can see where we've got, so here there's not a whole lot going on. You can't see any cells of honey at all. So the bees are probably a little bit hungry at the moment here. I'll have a quick look around to see if I've got a better example. Not really. So the bees are a little bit on the hungry side at the moment. There's a couple of cells of honey here, but really they've gotten a bit hungry and they've eaten most of the honey away from the windows. They tend to start pulling it back from the extremities. So you can see some honey and some cells here. When you've got a block of capped cells like that and then nothing, it's usually that they've actually eaten the rest away. Here you've got a couple of cells of honey there, but really not much to go on. So judging on last week, there's actually less honey here than last week. So we won't be expecting a whole lot to happen with our new super for a little while yet. Okay.
Can you go into more detail about what happens when a bee finds a patch of flowers?
So the process is quite interesting. The bees collecting nectar and bringing it back to the hive. First of all, what happens is scout bees fly up from the hive. Now, being a scout bee is one of the jobs some of the bees will do in their short life. They fly out and they'll look in up to a 10-kilometre radius. Isn't it amazing they can fly that far? They'll then find a nectar source, fly back to the hive, and they may even be carrying a nectar load that's almost their body weight. Now, they'll come back into the hive and in the dark, in amongst potentially 50,000 bees, they do a dance. And they do that dance by waggling their bottom in a way that is about 1 second of waggle is roughly equal to 1 kilometre of distance. So our understanding of the bees' language is, I'm sure, limited, because I've noticed they can tell the bees all sorts of intricate details. But 1 second equals about 1 kilometre. Then they do a dance with an axis in relation to the sun to show the direction of where the forage is. So if they're doing the figure of 8 dance, then there's a line in the middle of the figure of 8 that tells the hive the angle in relation to the sun of where the nectar is. If the nectar's really close, they'll do what's called a round dance, where they go around in a circle. Once the bees have that information, they will then fly out to that nectar source and they actually give quite accurate instructions of where it is by my experiments. And then a whole lot of bees will go and collect an amazing amount of nectar. A hive like this, when it's full of bees, could visit 50 million flowers in a day. They then fly back with that nectar load. They dribble the nectar down their tongue, wave it in the air as they fly to start reducing the water content of that nectar. When they get back into the hive, they pass that nectar to a receiver bee. So they don't just go and put it straight in the cell, they actually pass it to a receiver bee, which again starts to reduce the water content. That receiver bee then goes and starts to put it on the cell walls of a cell, and you'll see that getting splashed around here in the window sometimes when there's a good honey flow on. They then use evaporative techniques of fanning and moving the honey around, also taking water out through their bodies and reducing that water content to below 20%. In that process, they're adding enzymes to the honey also. So your honey ends up this amazing mixture of flowers from up to a 10-kilometre radius. Often one type of flower, but if there's not enough of that flower, they'll move on to other flowers as well, so it can be a mixture. And so it's full of vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients, healing properties, and as they get that honey down below 20%, they then put their capping on, and you can watch them put their capping on through the side windows or through the end window here when they've deduced that the water content is low enough for the honey to keep in their hive for later. So basically they're storing honey for the times ahead when there might not be a whole lot of nectar. Lucky for us, they're such amazing foragers. They often store more than they need, and we can share some too.
How do the bees create the wax capping?
So the wax capping is created by the wax gland, and it's done by the young bees. So one of the early jobs in a short life of a bee is producing wax and building comb. And what I find incredible is that they're producing these little flakes of wax from their wax gland, and then they're squishing that into shape with their mandibles and starting to build comb. Now, how one bee comes along with a little flake of wax and starts building comb in the perfect, intricate hexagons that they make, I don't know. There's some collective way where they can all group together and create this beautiful pattern of honeycomb in the brood box. It's really quite an incredible thing, and hundreds of bees might have contributed to that one single hexagon cell. So they really know what they're doing, and they're very organised.
Jennifer asks, do the worker bees eventually do all of the jobs?
So the worker bees do almost all of the jobs in the hive. The queen is basically an egg layer. She can lay up to a couple of thousand eggs a day, and that's what she does. Then the worker bees go through a range of jobs in their life. In the foraging season, they might only live for about 6 months. And the first thing they do is cleaning chores around the hive, where they're cleaning the cells they actually emerged from. Then they move on to things like, they could be the undertakers, taking out bees that have died, taken out of the hive. They move on to producing wax. They move on to feeding the baby bees. So one of the first jobs is feeding the babies in the hive. Then as they progress, they will go on their orientation flights and learn about the proximity of their hive, and then turn into a forager bee, where they will head out following instructions from a scout bee, collect that nectar or pollen and bring it back into the hive. So yes, the worker bees, who are all female, do almost all of the work in the hive. The male bees, there's people still looking into their role in the hive, but mostly their role is to fly out of the hive, hang out in a drone congregation area and wait to mate with a queen that hopefully flies by, and then if they're unsuccessful, they'll return back to the hive in the evening time.
We've got a few beginners wanting to know what would be the ideal setup, in your opinion, for a beginner, and what extra pieces of equipment alongside the hive might you need to get started?
Okay, great question. So we tend, the most popular hive that we sell is just like this, the Western Red Cedar 6-frame Flow Hive. Now, having 6 frames, it's a bit lighter to lift the top off, and it's also the cedar wood is the most popular because it's quite durable. You can oil it and leave it like this. It does need a bit of attention. If you want to keep it looking like this, you'll need to give it a rub and another coat of oil every 6 months or so. So for people who use this setup, which is the Flow Hive 6-frame, in all parts of the world. However, if you're in a cold climate, there is quite a popularity of using the larger size, the 7-frame size Flow Hive. A little bit more area for their babies in the bottom box, a little bit more honey storage for those winters that are long and cold.
And what about any additional pieces of equipment you might need to get started?
So you will need a smoker to do your brood inspections. You'll need a good bee suit or bee jacket like this one. You'll need gloves. You'll need the hive tool, and that's your basic setup. So that comes in a kit. We have a kit with the bee jacket or suit, the hive tool for lifting your frames out, and the gloves, and then the smoker is a separate purchase, although we do bundle it all together. If you want to have a look at our website, we've got bundles with everything you need to get started.
John's asking, is it best to do a beekeeping course before buying a flow hive, or can people use flow hives without any experience?
It's a great question. So to answer your question, people do it both ways. Now, some people like to do a lot of study before they jump into something, and other people like to jump straight into something and learn as they go. Both ways are valid. Now, if you decide to do a beekeeping course, that's a wonderful thing. You get some hands-on experience before starting beekeeping. If you decide to jump straight into it, then we have a lot of training material, a lot of videos showing you how to do all the things. You're starting your hive, building it up, adding your super, doing your brood inspections, looking for pests and disease, and so on. So if you're jumping straight into it, then do check out all of our training videos, and you may also like to have a look at thebeekeeper.org if you want some real in-depth information designed to take you from a beginner through to having a really deep knowledge about beekeeping. And there's a lot of experts in the world that are contributing to that space in order to give really high quality training material. Thank you very much for watching. Let us know what you'd like to hear next week. We do have one more burning question, and otherwise tune in again next week.
Rick has an excellent question. He asks, can you use wax on the flow frame scraped from a separate hive, or should it only be used by the hive you're putting the Flow Hive Super on?
Okay, great question. So that brings about the disease issue. So generally it's a good idea to keep your equipment separate from hive to hive if you can. That includes your hive tool. If it's waxy, then heat it up a little bit, scrape that wax off, and give it a bit of a clean, so the next time you use it, it's nice and clean. You're not passing pathogens from one hive to another. Now, flow hive beekeeping has the advantage of you're not taking all the honey supers off to a processing shed and then bringing all those frames back. My experience of doing that when I was running a small commercial apiary was that it was very hard to control which frame went to which hive and therefore there was a lot of sharing of equipment between hives. Generally the Flow Hive stays with that box. However, there does come time sometimes when you need to move equipment from hive to hive, but when you do that, you do risk sharing things like AFB or EFB, which are two diseases that honeybees can get from one hive to another. So where possible, don't share between hives. So don't add the wax from one hive to another. But if there's a good reason, let's say you're taking a split, or you've got a hive with a failing queen and you want to take some resources from this hive, some with bee eggs on it, and add it to this hive so they can raise a new queen, then that might be a good enough reason in order to share equipment or parts of one hive to another hive. So if you don't need to, then don't do it. If you need to, then it's a risk you take in beekeeping. Thank you very much for watching. Let us know what you'd like us to cover next week, and thank you for tuning in.